This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Housing is probably the number one topic that people want to hear about here in Dover because it is a topic that everyone can relate to. So continuing our desire to educate and have conversations about housing, I'm joined today by two folks from New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, Ryan Polk and George Regan. Ryan, you might remember, was the housing navigator for the city of Dover, and we welcome him back, and we welcome George in for the first time. Gentlemen.
Good morning, Chris. Great to be back.
Good morning. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. Ryan, you've fled the coop. What's your role with New Hampshire Housing, and how can the listener benefit from that role?
Absolutely. So, yes, I left the city at the tail end of the first week in January, joined New Hampshire Housing in their multifamily development group. So working with that team to help finance multifamily housing solutions statewide.
And George, you've been with New Hampshire Housing for as long as I can remember. So what's your role with the corporation?
So I'm the Director of Community Engagement. Before, it started out as the Housing Awareness Program Administrator. And I bring that up because New Hampshire Housing had a focus a long time ago, back in early 2000s, looking at this ongoing housing issue in terms of costs, increasing cost, supply issues, and realized that we really needed, as an organization, to start talking to people about this real impact of the lack of housing and housing policy at the local and state level that needed to be looked at to try to unstick some of this lack of building that was happening. So they began this program. Ben Frost was who was an employee at New Hampshire Housing, has now moved on to Rhode Island Housing and been there for years, started in that position. And it was really about educating communities about what's happening with housing and trying to sort of realize that to sort of change that equation was going to be a long-term process, and it needed someone in New Hampshire Housing to try to help drive that. And so the title has changed because we realized that, none of this happens by coming up with just data and saying, here's the housing data and it's horrific, and so do something about it. It really takes conversation and talking with people at state level, local level to help affect change. And so that's why that title is like that. I work with Sarah Reitzman, who also has that in her title as well, so that we can do the work at the ground level and help empower people at the ground level to have good conversations. Because this housing issue isn't just in Dover, it's statewide, regional, and national.
It's funny. I think everyone wants a silver bullet, right? Everyone wants to have some data put in front of them and be like, oh my God, I didn't know that. The whole world is a different place today. You see these things in movies and TV where all of a sudden, it's the magic thing we all needed. Housing, as you say, is much more complicated than that. Here in Dover, we've talked about what I refer to as the 5 L's, that there's labor, lumber, legislation, land, and lending involved, that all 5 of those contribute to the cost of housing. And in my mind, the municipality really only has impact on the legislative part, unless we're going to get into financing housing. But we're not providing labor. We don't have a forest to go and cut down and create the actual materials. My understanding from what your role and what New Hampshire Housing is looking to do is to say, as you ended your statement, it's not a localized problem. And there's so many factors at a state, regional, and national level that all play into this. It's curious to me why there isn't more of we got to get behind this. People like to say we need more housing, but we don't see more housing to the degree we really need to.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, this gets back to, some of the surveys that's been done, like St. Anselm College did a survey recently, and I don't have the data right in front of me, but talking about the number of people that agree we need to have more affordable housing. We need to have it. An even more precise question, do you agree you need more housing in your neighborhood? And the answer is yes. But really, when it comes down to it, there's conversations where housing falls into my thinking about costs, my taxes, about conservation, which is an important topic. And so I think it can become a very complicated conversation. And so, to your point, data can't just, be the panacea for sort of changing it. It's like, how do we bring in the multifaceted aspects of a conversation, of which housing is a part, to say, how do we talk about this and move beyond it? And what do we understand are the levers that are available to us? You talk with the 5 Ls. We've used that a lot because I think what I would always hear a lot of, it's just a demand and supply issue. And at the very simplest element, it certainly is. But if you were to say well, let's talk about how we regulate supply. And, there was growth moratoriums, years ago that were overturned. There was just, large lot zoning or not investing in infrastructure. All those might have been part and parcel of a way to say, I want to make sure that I limit housing. But more importantly, it's sort of understanding all of those parts that are interwoven to try to make even housing happen.
There are 2 conundrums in the state that I think follow housing conversation. The first is leave me alone, do what I want, but my neighbor can't do what they want. You shouldn't regulate things, but no more density. I don't want to have someone in my backyard. And then the second one is I want my community to stay exactly the same. Where are my kids going to live if I have kids? Right. I think that's one of those conversations I remember attending. It was either a workforce housing conversation or a Plan New Hampshire conversation in Barrington. I was on the panel as a local expert, which I'm sure did not go over well because the big city of Dover coming to Barrington telling them what to do. And I said to one of the people that said, we've got enough density, things are good. I said, where are your kids? Where do they live? Oh, they couldn't find homes here. We hear that a lot. I'm sure you hear it in the state. Is people want when it's in their interest. There's one conversation, and when it's not, and that's a totally normal human position to take.
Right.
So how do we have that conversation at the statewide level to say we need to be welcoming for everyone, and we need to recognize that times change? If household size was what it was in the 1920s as opposed to the 2020s, where you had mom, dad, their parents, and their grandkids all living in the same house, we would have a lot less need for housing units.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when you think about, when we talk about the housing we need by 2040, by 2030, 60,000, 90,000, and people think, well, why do we need that? We've got a population that isn't really growing. And then, I think about, so I live in Dover and the house that I live in is a 3-bedroom house, but there isn't a family in it. And so you've got this consumption of what's there as a housing unit being underutilized, and this is why we hear a lot of home sharing programs where, that is capacity. If I wanted to do that, I could help be a part of the solution, but it doesn't get to the crux of people who want to live and control their own, where they live, be it rental for a while or then moving to home ownership. And, I think that's just a real challenge. And again, trying to think back to possible solutions. Thinking back to that property owner rights, one of the things about the accessory dwelling unit law that passed in 2017 at the state level was sort of that understanding, we should allow property owners to have a little bit more leeway in what we do. I mean, we talk about local control, but like you said, we may not want our neighbor to do what we already did. And I think one of the things that we all know, and I hear it when I watch planning board meetings here in Dover or participate in others, is that once I've sort of attained what I want, the rest is just, you're taking farmland and you're turning it into housing, yet the house you're on probably was farmland. And I get
your neighbors probably didn't like when your house was built.
Right. And I get it. And I think that's why data is important, but it's important when people want it and need it for further understanding. And so I think we believe that how do we have these conversations and a lot of them in our areas so that we're not just saying, look, we need more housing because we've got big business coming in. I think people understand the connection between housing and economic development, but it doesn't get past me and my concern of, maybe I understand the need for more housing, but I'm looking at my property tax bill. I'm unsure about what that's going to mean in terms of kids. I'm not sure what that's going to mean about municipal services. And is there a way to be able to, have conversations, provide that information and have people maybe understand and respect that, some of the issues that I might have aren't as important as my community's growth and development overall. And that gets to understanding, the things that go into our tax bills and the management of municipal government. And I think that's a whole complicated other issue, but it's really, really important to understand because I think we oversimplify that and think that any new development will, why are my taxes still going up? I will say it as a side, and I often say this to people, and it spans my life growing up in Manchester before I moved to Dover and then living in Dover. And so I live on a corner, and the blessing and the curse in the winter is the Dover snowplows that come by. And I swear that snowplow comes by every 42 minutes and definitely right after I've shoveled my driveway. In Manchester, I seem to recall, I don't know if that street was plowed more than once a day. And so we have to realize what's the value we get for services. And while I may be going a little bit far off the housing topic, I think it's an interesting anecdote. Things may go up because we get great personnel, there's costs associated with it, and we provide really good service.
Well, I think the tie back that I hear you speaking to is I always say people don't argue that the tax rate is too high. They argue that the return on their investment is not what they want. And the same with housing. People want more housing, but they really need to understand what the return on investment of having more housing, because they think it's going to be one thing. But then when you actually look at the data and you look at what the actual benefits are of welcoming more people in the community, broadening the tax base, whatever you want to talk to, right? And you look at the return on investment, I think that's where the conversation gets similar. Ryan, George mentioned that we're at a deficit on housing, that we need more housing citywide, statewide. How do you transition from working in the community to working with 200 plus communities?
That's a great question. I think that it's obviously a statewide deficit. It's a problem. I think one thing that I definitely took for granted in my time in Dover is just a general acknowledgement that we are a city that is growing. We're a city that is still finding itself, checking itself, and acknowledging that we have to do things in order to make that happen. I think a challenge that we'll have in the state is just that is not the norm in every community. So part of it is the work that George and Sarah and their team do of educating and humanizing this issue and having important conversations with people to just wake them up and let them know that to solve this problem, it's going to take a little bit from everyone, and that we all just kind of have to buckle up and work together to get there. Otherwise, I don't know, you'd hate to see communities die off because we didn't appropriately plan for it.
When we talk about the need for housing, George, I might have heard you wrong, so correct me. By 2030, we need 60 to 90,000 more homes than we have now?
Yeah, by 2030, the estimate is needing 60,000. By 2040, we need 90,000. And we're already at about a 20,000 deficit. Now, there's been a lot of development that's happened recently, and I think that's important to mention because I think people see that and they just think Dover and other places, Lebanon, but there's been really a dearth of building. When you look at the building permits we've had in the 80s and the 90s, was double that of what happened after 2007, 2008. And so we've been lagging in this housing production. And so that just creates its own issues.
So roughly we need 12,000 new homes per year in the state over the next 5 years to meet the 60,000, which is nice, but probably not realistic. That gets to a thought that I had that when we had Rob Dappas from New Hampshire Housing on, he was talking about at the time that it's not as simple as saying we're going to build the houses, that it doesn't flip the switch and you've built it. There are a lot of levers, gears, et cetera, that have to be part of that. So there needs to be a ramp up. There needs to be the approvals. You need to have the material. You need to have the actual labor to build the homes. Right. And it's good to recognize goals and it's good to say this is where we need to be. But I think to the point of the education, there comes back to that. How do you, and Ryan, I guess I'm going to ask you this, how do you get that message out to the communities that have said, oh, growth is bad? I hear it here in Dover that we've got too much growth. We've had 1% growth over the past 20 years. That's like negligible. And George, you mentioned having Sarah, and I think we need to have Sarah in because I know that she can speak to the housing and student enrollment correlation. Right. Because that to me is the other area that I think people sort of conflate.
Yeah. I think it's absolutely right. When we have these conversations about housing, there's things that just are like the top things is school enrollment issue. And because that's so important, we've done school enrollment studies for the past 15 years or so and started with Russ Tebow from Applied Economic Research. And he would reprise that study and we would find some of the similar things. This report really is also finding some of the similar things about the number of school kids, but it's something that comes up. But I go back to your 5 L's. It's like I really think it's important for people to sort of understand that interplay because even when you try to build the opportunity, change some land use regulations, allow detached ADUs, let's say by right, they're not just built overnight. Right. Anyone who's a homeowner who's listening knows how am I going to pay for that? And it's not a $10,000 cost, it's $100,000, $200,000. And so those things don't just change overnight. And really one of the things getting back to that number is it's not really a number that I sort of trumpet because I don't think it's helpful to small communities to say like, well, what I can do. But much like you went to the 12,000, if a community was to think like, well, maybe I can allow for ADUs and how many might that be in any given year, you can see this incremental way that, that you aggregate up and you start realizing you're making a big dent because you're allowing some housing choice. And I think some of that is, how do we allow that in our communities? How do we feel comfortable about incremental growth, especially in smaller communities? I will say, I'll take a second to talk about the Invest NH Planning and Zoning Grant Program that we've been working with our partners at UNH Cooperative Extension, Plan New Hampshire, and New Hampshire School Association, and the Business and Economic Affairs Department. And, there are communities that are having conversations that are making incremental changes. And so I'm not going to say I don't care if that doesn't, amount to something by 2030, but what I really care about is the community understanding its role and how housing fits into their own community economy. And, by the way, as we're an aging population, we need a lot of workers that aren't high paid to take care of us. And I think of LNAs working in assisted livings, taking care of our parents and grandparents and things. And that's an important piece. And I think that gets back to why this has to become a conversation that mixes data with personal stories and personal witness about, what's it mean to me? Because I think those are important things that connect the complicated aspects of housing in general.
When you were talking about maybe it's okay to think on the more granular level, and if a community can allow ADUs, which they have to, or whatever the next step is, Ryan, I'm thinking the old adage of 100 pennies equals $1, $100 equals $100. It's that, you can grow that way. And that maybe the old idea of don't eat the elephant, eat parts of the elephant, and then all of a sudden you're full. And I think I'd be curious to hear from you on how do you translate that to communities?
I think one thing that's working really well for us in New Hampshire, and again, I think because of a lot of the education, and honestly because people feel it now, it's just more expensive to exist and it's harder to buy a house. And I think that internalization is helping people kind of across the board, from not just New Hampshire Housing and not just planning departments, to think through what can I do to kind of help solve this problem. And I know in Dover, we had a lot of success reaching out to area financial institutions to try to figure out how to finance ADUs and home renovations and adding new units for little mom and pop landlords. And it's things like that where you have people joining the conversation, kind of promoting those products, and kind of step by step, you find where the issues are and you target that, you bring in the right people, and you're all working together to try to see movement. And I'm optimistic that we can get there if we just keep these conversations going and just promote success.
What does success look like?
That's interesting. We've been saying, celebrate the micro successes. I think of the town of Sandwich that's allowing, was it 2-family conversions? Enfield that allows 2 accessory dwelling units. And so that success isn't necessarily units in the ground, but it's moving forward with housing policy that recognizes its role in making sure we have vibrant communities and vibrant economies. And I think to me, that's it. And then seeing that it's sustainable, that people aren't seeing being that it's way too much. And I think that that's a good way to look at success, and looking at people's sort of understanding of it. I think one of the things, Sarah and I put together a publication, How Do You Talk About Housing? And part of it was to really get to that level of talking about what their housing needs are. And so when you start realizing that people are changing regulations in their community to meet people's real defined needs, I think that's successful on a lot of levels because we're not demanding something. And I think that's the fine line between always looking at there's so much opportunity at the local level that doesn't need state level. But, there is going to be a bill, and there is a bill in the legislature to allow detached ADUs by right. So the 2017 law is only for attached, not detached. And, we don't need that state law to make detached ADUs happen. We just need a force of will of people understanding, what can we do in our community that makes sense? And that's why there's been such, I think, heat and light on accessory dwelling units, because it's incremental in nature.
Ryan, you and I had talked about that before because I wanted to allow that maybe 5 years ago, and the planning board just wasn't ready for it. In fact, I think at one point you and I talked about it. I was like, oh, we did it. And you were like, no, you attempted to do it. The conversion one is a good one too. That's something that I think communities need to wade in first feet, then knees, et cetera, on that, because it's something that initially sounds scary. Right? God, you're allowing to go, you're doubling the density. But the reality is, if you do it properly, if you do it to accommodate your community's characteristics, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, look at the conversions on Lexington Street and other streets in Dover. And yeah, I absolutely agree. And this is where I think there is some good connection back to the state, because last year, one of the wins legislatively was allow single family conversions to up to 4 units and not require sprinkler systems. And so this gets back again to your 5 Ls. It's like, we have to recognize there are headwinds that get in the way that are economically driven that stop that. So for a homeowner for ADUs, that could be a tough road to do it, but at least there's not sort of state level barriers in the way. And so I think that was a big important win. And I think the other one was for units above 10, not allowing a municipality to mandate more than 1.5 parking spaces. And some people may like that, some people may not, but we know the data is out there that it's just not necessary. But we know that that's a real high cost to things. So I think that's a great place where state level intervention can really help unlock in some of the issues that happen at the local level when towns are really well-meaning to try to move something forward.
So as we wrap up here, I'm curious, is there something we didn't cover that you want to make sure the listener hears, something that we should follow up on at a later date, or are you just ready to say goodbye?
Yeah, no, I think that I would say this has been a great conversation. I'm actually glad we didn't get into a ton of the data, but just want to make sure people know that home prices are really high and they affect first-time home buyers a lot. Rents are still really high. There's been a lot of development, but it isn't really like in other places in the country, like in Nashville and Austin. It's not really tamping down rental rates, but celebrate the development that's happening. And I think it's always good. Feel free to go to nhhousing.org. We've got a lot of resources and we're always available to help with conversations. We support regional workforce housing coalitions. The Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast serves this area, as well as others. And those are great resources for communities to connect, with people to connect in their communities and help with the conversation, because it really begins, I think, and ends with conversation in terms of trying to make good progress forward. And I think there has been. It's unfortunate that the pandemic brought in federal funds, but to say that we've used ARPA funds in a way that helps provide technical resources, especially to a lot of smaller communities that are willing but don't have the wherewithal, like there's been some great successes. And I think I've been really proud to be involved in that. And I think my call to action for folks is stay active in your local community about housing and other things. And if things are confusing, give us a call and let us try to help you out.
Just reflecting back to kind of how we started this conversation of there really is no silver bullet, there's no simple answer, and that's true. Like New Hampshire Housing tries to address this issue. We're trying to build a lot of housing, but there's no way that we're going to be able to build all of it. So it does take a little bit from everyone. It takes thinking outside the box. It takes willing communities. And I really do think that together we can get there.
The simple things probably aren't worth doing, meaning that if a problem is complex, it's probably the one you want to focus on and the one that you want to bring all hands together on and solve. So I think it's actually a good thing that there is a silver bullet, because I think, to George's point, we need to bring people together. We need to make them see the data, but also recognize their personal relationship with the scenario and the data.
Absolutely.
So thank you both for coming in. I appreciate your chat with the listener, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
This week, in 1927, residents of Dover and the state of New Hampshire faced potentially significant increases in motor vehicle operating costs. Several bills before the legislature threatened to add substantial expenses for car owners, with one Dover automobile dealer estimating an additional $100 in registration and operating costs for even modestly priced vehicles. 4 key bills were slated for hearings at the State House in Concord. 2 bills proposed returning to previous higher registration fees and assessments. A third bill aimed to increase the gasoline tax by 1 cent per gallon to 3 cents. The fourth bill would require mandatory insurance for all vehicle owners, similar to a law recently enacted in Massachusetts. The proposed registration fee structure would implement a graduated system based on vehicle weight. For vehicles with pneumatic tires, rates would range from 45 cents per 100 pounds for lighter vehicles up to 60 cents per 100 pounds for heavier ones. Additional fees would apply for vehicles with hard rubber or steel tires. Local automobile dealers mobilized to oppose these measures, urging car owners to attend the upcoming hearings and voice their objections. They warned that without public resistance, the committees would likely report favorably on the bills, leading to their eventual passage. Foster's Daily Democrat highlighted these proposals on its front page under the headline, "Autoists Urge to Get Busy," reflecting the urgency felt by the local business community. The paper noted that owners of larger vehicles would face even steeper increases than the $100 estimated for smaller cars, potentially affecting both private citizens and commercial operators throughout New Hampshire. Stay tuned for a future episode of This Week in Dover History to discover how contentious this fight became.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.